In 1847, Liberia, the land of liberty, was founded by freed slaves seeking refuge and freedom on the continent of Africa. But beneath the surface of this land of the free was a complex history shaped by America's foreign policy on the continent of Africa at the height of the Cold War. A history marked by both hope and tragedy. It would all unravel during the Reagan years at the White House, sparking the first major conflict between freed black slaves, African Americans returning to the continent, and indigenous Africans in Liberia. A conflict that would leave a lasting legacy on Africa's first free nation. Hello and welcome to the channel. This is AOB Africa, our business. Commentary on Africa, commentary on diaspora, where we hope to connect our brothers and sisters all over the world. So remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Let's get to it. The founding of Liberia was championed by the American Colonization Society, a controversial organization that aimed to resettle freed slaves in Africa. SCS had both abolitionists against slavery as well as slave owners whose main mission really was to kick freed slaves out of America altogether. The first group established a settlement which they called Christopolis and later renamed Monrovia after James Monroe, the American president who at the time was pushing for the resettlement of slaves in Africa, the colony of Liberia. So by 1847, the new tribe of Americo Liberians, as they were called, essentially established an independent Liberia. They declared independence of Liberia, and within that time, three families emerged as the centers of power in Liberia: the Barclays, the Kings, and the Tubmans. They proceeded to construct a colonial system and concentrating all the wealth and privilege in the hands of the ruling Americo elites. With time, this fomented a lot of resentment from the indigenous population of Liberia. In 1931, the International Commission would find Americo-Liberian rule guilty of involvement in organized slavery. Still, Liberia's 1% continued their hold on the land of liberty. Fast forward, Tubman exits as president of Liberia, and William Tolbert, the grandson of Southern Carolina slaves, becomes the new president of Liberia. William Tolbert, also a Baptist minister, had been at the helm of the vice presidency for a good 20 years. He would set about reforming the nation, but Tolbert's regime would soon run into headwinds, leading to the riots in the streets of Monrovia in 1979.
There's been a lot of trouble in the Liberian capital, Monrovia, over the weekend. It all began, apparently, with an announcement that rice prices were to be increased. People came out onto the streets on Saturday and Sunday and went on the rampage. Tear gas was used by the police to try and disperse the crowds. They opened fire, and a number of people have been killed and injured.
The issue, my fellow citizens, cannot be that of the price of rice. For I've made myself completely clear on this issue. For we'll never abdicate our sacred trusts to the chaotic propensities of evil-minded individuals who pursue their selfish interests under the guise of seeking the people's welfare.
They were a concerted effort, he said, to wreck and overthrow the government.
The riots would spiral into a series of poor political decisions by Tolbert that would eventually seal his fate as head of state. The 12th of April 1980 would mark a bloody and sad chapter in the history of Liberia. A young Master Sergeant Samuel Doe of the Crown tribe, at just 28 years of age, together with his small band of soldiers, attacked the presidential mansion in Monrovia and assassinated President William Tolbert in a most brutal manner, ending over a century of dominance by Liberia's Americo tribe. There's evidence to suggest that the US government was either aware or complicit in the events surrounding the coup that led to the assassination of William Tolbert. Samuel Doe had received military training in the US. But even more important was that Reagan's administration provided military and financial support to Samuel Doe's regime following that coup. Reagan even referred to Doe as Chairman Doe.
Chairman Doe told me of his government's ambitious goals, including the return to democratic institutions and economic stabilization.
Turning a blind eye to the suffering of Liberians, especially Americo Liberians, from whom he had taken over. Some of these Liberian exiles would cross into neighboring countries. In Burkina Faso, for example, Blaise Compaoré orchestrated a coup using exiled Liberians and eventually the killing of Thomas Sankara. So rather than a new dawn as was promised by President Samuel Doe, his government turned to one of tyranny and gross human rights abuse. Reagan's decision to support Doe's regime, despite Doe butchering his way to power, reflects the prioritization of America's strategic interests over democratic principles and human rights concerns that America had so much espoused. So America's policy to engage with Samuel Doe despite his atrocities in Liberia necessitated the birth of one of the most atrocious wars in that region for close to 2 decades. Critics have argued that America was motivated by its desire to maintain influence in Liberia and counter Soviet influence in the region at the height of the Cold War. It would take the arrest of Harvard-trained Ellen Sirleaf Johnson to finally get the attention of the Reagan administration. You'll remember that Sirleaf Johnson had also been a minister in Tolbert's government, one of the few who survived the brutal public executions of Tolbert's government ministers. Without funding from the US and growing enemies at home, Doe could not withstand the onslaught by coup plotters Charles Taylor and Johnson, men who had previously worked with him. Even ECOMOG, the regional West African body, was unable to save Samuel Doe. With the brutal elimination of Samuel Doe, Liberia plunged into a full-blown civil war in the 80s all through to the 90s. And Liberia's civil war did not only affect Liberia, it affected the countries within the region, especially Sierra Leone. And you'll remember the involvement of Charles Taylor and Foday Sankoh in the blood minerals that were being hived off Sierra Leone, the diamonds. The legacy of America's foreign policy in Liberia, from its founding to its near collapse in the 1980s, continues to cast a long shadow over the nation and the region of West Africa. Yet amidst this wreckage, there is hope for Liberia. Liberia gave Africa its first female president, Ellen Sirleaf Johnson. Liberia also bounced back from a deadly Ebola virus that decimated many lives in Liberia and that region. Africa, as it is today, is experiencing a major rebirth. The focus for economies growing in Africa is looking robust, and Africans of diaspora are trooping to the continent as the continent embraces its lost children, triggered obviously by Ghana's year of return in 2019. Therefore, the history of Liberia is a reminder that Africa, and indeed the world, must embrace inclusivity, must embrace diversity. The true Whig Party in Liberia had engaged in politics of exclusion, totally dominated the scene in Liberia since 1847. 133 years of domination without any major involvement of the local community. So this bred fertile ground for the final explosion of the wars and the kind of atrocities we saw in the region, but majorly so, America's role in supporting a government that had butchered its way to power essentially legitimized that regime. And to the eyes of the world and to the West, Samuel Doe and his party seemingly were on the right path. The election that was conducted in Liberia, the first of its kind, because indeed the former elections essentially just revolved around Americo Liberians. This election offered the first hope, but then again, Samuel Doe and his cronies manipulated that election, and he eventually ended up becoming president in 1985. What followed that was total tyranny, fertile ground again for his own deposition and brutal murder. So the history of Liberia is a stark reminder that we must go the path of inclusivity, of diversity. Africa belongs to all of its children in the diaspora and on the continent. The country seems to be on the path to prosperity, and that is something that Africa and the diaspora must celebrate. So kindly share your thoughts on America's policy on the continent of Africa. Countries will be looking out for their own interests naturally as independent states, but to what extent can individual nations then interfere in the internal affairs of other countries and prop up regimes that eventually destroy these very nations? The cost is really high. So as we reflect on Liberia's checkered history, we must realize, we must take heed of the challenges that have existed. Let's embrace a new path for Africa, a new path for Africa's diaspora as the continent welcomes back its children, as Africa steps into the future looking strong, looking robust. Should Africa leverage on its resources and its population without always involving the Western world? This is crucial for us. Share your thoughts about the Liberia of today, bouncing back, and the promise of Africa as things stand. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. And don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to like to help us build this channel. Africa, indeed, is our business. Thank you for your time, and we'll see you again in the next video. I'm out.